Chapter 5 Rulers and Buildings. Figure 1 shows the first balcony of Qutub Minar. Qutbuddin Aibak had this constructed around 1199. Notice the pattern created under the balcony by the small arches and geometrical design. Can you see two hands of inscriptions under the balcony? These are in Arabic. Notice that the surface of the minar is curved and angular. Placing an inscription on such a surface required a great precision. Only the most skilled craftspersons could perform this task. Remember that very few buildings were made of stone or bricks 800 years ago. What would have been the impact of a building like the Qutub Minar on observers in the 13th century? Between the 8th and the 18th century, kings and their officers built two kinds of structures. The first were forts, palaces, gardens, residences and tombs, safe, protected and grandiose places of rest in this world and the next. The second were structures meant for public activity including temples, mosques, tanks, wells, caravansaries and bazaars. Kings were expected to care for their subjects and by making structures for their use and comfort, rulers hoped to win their praise. Construction activity was also carried out by others, including the merchants. They built temples, mosques and wells. However, domestic architecture, large mansions, havelis of merchants has survived only from the 18th century. Engineering skills and construction. Monuments provide an insight into the technologies used for construction. Take something like a roof, for example. We can make this by placing wooden beams or a slab of stone across four walls. But the task becomes difficult if we want to make a large room with an elaborate superstructure. This requires more sophisticated skills. Between the 7th and the 10th centuries, architects started adding more rooms, doors and windows to buildings. Roofs, doors and windows were still made by placing a horizontal beam across two vertical columns, a style of architecture called tribet or corbelled. Between the 8th and 13th century, the tribet style was used in the construction of temples, mosques, tombs, and in buildings attached to large steps well baulis. Temple construction in the early 11th century. The Kandariya Mahadeva temple dedicated to Shiva was constructed in 999 by the king Dhangadeva of the Chandela dynasty. Figure 3b is the plan of the temple. An ornament gateway led to an entrance and the main hall, Mahamandapa, where dances were performed. The image of the chief deity was kept in the main shrine, Garbhagriha. This was the place for ritual worship where only the king, his immediate family and priests gathered. The Khajuraho complex contained royal temples where commoners were not allowed entry. The temples were decorated with elaborately carved sculpture. Figure 4. The Raja Rajeshwara temple at the Thanjavur had the tallest shikhar amongst temples of its time. Constructing it was not easy because there were no cranes in those days and the 90 tons stones for the top of shikhar was too heavy to lift manually, so the architect built an inclined path to the top of the temple, placed the boulder on rollers and rolled it all the way to the top. The path started more than 4 km away so that it would not be too steep. This was dismantled after the temple was constructed, but the residents of the area remembered the experience of the constructions of the temple for a long time. Even now, a village near the temple is called Charupallam, the village of the incline. Two technological and stylistic developments are noticeable from the 12th century. First, the weight of the superstructure above the doors and windows was sometimes carried by arcs. This architectural form was called accurate. Second, limestone cement was increasingly used in construction. This was a very high quality cement which, when mixed with stone chips, hardened into concrete. This made construction of the large structures easier and faster. Take a look at the construction site in figure 6. Building temples, mosques and tanks. Temples and mosques were beautifully constructed because they were places of worship. They were also meant to demonstrate the power, wealth and devotion of the patron. Take the example of the Raja Rajeshwara temple. An inscription mentions that it was built by King Raja Rajadeva for the worship of his god Raja Rajeshwaram. Notice how the names of the ruler and the god are very similar. The king took the god's name because it was auspicious and he wanted to appear like a god. Through the rituals of worship in the temple, one god, Raja Rajadeva, honored another Raja Rajeshwaram. The largest temples were all constructed by kings. The other lesser deities in the temple were gods and goddesses of the allies of and subordinates of the ruler. The temple was a miniature model of the world ruled by the king and his allies. As they worshipped their deities together in the royal temples, it seemed as if they brought the just rule of the gods on earth. Muslim sultans and padshahs did not claim to be incarnation of God, but Persian court chronicles describe the sultan as the shadow of God. An inscription in the Quwwat al-Islam mosques explained that God chose Alauddin as a king because he had the qualities of Moses and Solomon, the great lawgivers of the past. The greatest lawgiver and architect was God himself. He created the world out of chaos and introduced order and symmetry. As each new dynasty came to power, kings wanted to emphasize their moral right to be rulers. Constructing places of worship provided rulers with the chance to proclaim their close relationship with God, especially important in an age of rapid political change. Rulers also offered patronage to the learned and pious and tried to transform their capitals and cities into great cultural centers that brought fame to their rule and their realm. It was widely believed that the rule of a just king would be an age of plenty, when the heavens would not withhold rain, at the same time making precious water available by constructing tanks and reservoirs was highly praised. Sultan Iltutmish won universal respect for constructing a large reservoir just outside Delhi Ikwana. It was called the Hauzi-Sultani or the King's Reservoir. Can you find it on map on in Chapter 3? Rulers often constructed tanks and reservoirs, big and small, for use by ordinary people. Sometimes these tanks and reservoirs were part of a temple mosque. Note the small tank in the Jama Masjid in Figure 7, or a Gurudwara, a place of worship and congregation for Sikhs, Figure 8. Why were temples targeted? Because kings built temples to demonstrate their devotion to God and their power and wealth. It is not surprising that when they attacked one another's kingdom, they often targeted these buildings. In the early 9th century, when the Pandyan king Srimara Shivallabha invaded Sri Lanka and defeated the king Sena 831 to 851, the Buddhist monk and chronicler Dhammakirti noted he removed all the valuables. The statue of Buddha made entirely of gold in the Jewel Palace and the golden images in the various monasteries. All these he seized. The blow to the pride of the Sinhalese ruler had to be avenged, and the next Sinhalese ruler, Sena II, ordered his general to invade Madurai, the capital of the Pandyas. The Buddhist chronicler noted that the expedition made a special effort to find and restore the gold statue of the Buddha. Similarly, in the early 11th century, when the Chola king Rajendra first built a Shiva temple in his capital, he filled it with prized statues seized from defeated rulers. An incomplete list included a sun pedestal from the Chalukyas, a Ganesha statue, and several statues of Durga, a Nandi statue from the eastern Chalukyas, an image of Bhairava, a form of Shiva, and Bhairavi from the Kalingas of Odisha, and a Kali statue from the Palas of Bengal. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni was a contemporary of Rajendra I. During his campaign in the subcontinent, he attacked the temples of defeated kings and looted their wealth and idols. Sultan Mahmud was not a very important ruler at that time, but by destroying temples, especially the one at Somnath, he tried to win credit as a great hero of Islam. In the political culture of the Middle Ages, most rulers displayed their political might and military success by attacking and looting the places of worship of defeated rulers, gardens, tombs, and forts. Under the Mughals, architecture became more complex. Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, and especially Shah Jahan was personally interested in literature, art, and architecture. In his autobiography, Babur described his interest in planning and laying out formal gardens placed within rectangular wall enclosures and divided into 4 quarters by artificial channels. These gardens were called Chahar Bagh, 4 gardens, because of their symmetrical division into quarters. Beginning with Akbar, some of the most beautiful Chahar Bagh were constructed by Jahangir and Shah Jahan in Kashmir, Agra and Delhi. There were several important architectural innovations during Akbar's reign. For inspiration, Akbar's architecture turned to the tombs of his Central Asian ancestors. Taimur, the central towering dome and the tall gateway Pistak became important aspects of Mughal architecture. First visible in Humayun's tomb, the tomb was placed in the center of a huge formal charbagh and built in the tradition known as Eight Paradises or Hast Behist, a central hall surrounded by 8 rooms. The building was constructed with red sandstone edged with white marbles. It was during Shah Jahan's reign that the different elements of Mughal architecture were fused together in a grand harmonious synthesis. His reign witnessed a huge amount of construction activity, especially in Agra and Delhi. The ceremonial halls of public and private audience, Diwan-e-Khas, Diwan-e-Aam, were carefully planned, placed within a large courtyard. These courts were also described as Chihil Sutun or 40 pillars halls. Shah Jahan's audience halls were especially constructed to resemble a mosque. The pedestal on which his throne was placed was frequently described as the Qibla, the direction faced by Muslims at prayer, since everybody faced that direction when court was in session. The idea of the king as a representative of God on earth was suggested by these architectural features. The connection between royal justice and the imperial court was emphasized by Shah Jahan in his newly constructed court in the Red Fort at Delhi. Behind the emperor's throne were a series of Pitra Dura inlays that depicted the legendary Greek god Orpheus playing the lute. It was believed that Orpheus' music could calm ferocious beasts until they coexisted together peaceably. The construction of Shah Jahan's audience hall aimed to communicate that the king's justice would treat the high and the low as equals, creating a world where all could live together in harmony. In the early years of his reign, Shah Jahan's capital was at Agra, a city where the nobility had constructed their homes on the banks of the river Yamuna. These were set in the midst of formal gardens constructed in the Charbagh format. The Charbagh garden also had a variation that historians described as the riverfront garden. In this, the dwelling was not located in the middle of the Charbagh but at its edge close to the bank of the river. Shah Jahan adapted the riverfront garden in the layout of the Taj Mahal, the grandest architectural accomplishment of his reign. Here, the white marble mausoleum was placed on a terrace by the edge of the river and the garden was to its south. Shah Jahan developed this architectural form as a means to control the access that nobles had to the river in the new city of Shahjahanabad that he constructed in Delhi. The imperial palace commanded the riverfront only. Especially favored nobles like his eldest son Dara Shikoh were given access to the river. All others had to construct their homes in the city away from the river Yamuna. Reason and empire. As construction activity increased between the 8th and 18th century, there was also a considerable sharing of ideas across regions. The traditions of one region were adopted by another. In Vijayanagara, for example, the elephant stables of the rulers were strongly influenced by the style of architecture found in the adjoining Sultanate of Bijapur and Golconda. See Chapter 6. In Vrindavan near Mathura, temples were constructed in architectural styles that were very similar to the Mughal palaces in Fatehpur Sikri. The creation of large empires that brought different regions under their rule helped in this across fertilization of artistic form and architectural styles. Mughal rulers were particularly skilled in adapting regional architectural style in the construction of their own buildings. In Bengal, for example, the local rulers had developed a roof that was designed to resemble a thatched hut. The Mughals liked this Bangla dome. See figure 11 and 12 in chapter 9. so much that they used it in their architecture. The impact of other regions was also evident in Akbar's capital at Fatehpur Sikri. Many of the buildings show the influence of the architectural style of Gujarat and Malwa. Even though the authority of the Mughal ruler waned in the 18th century, the architectural styles developed under their patronage were constantly used and adapted by other rulers whenever they tried to stabilize their own kingdoms.